Before we begin working on the C group scene and setting up our population zones, I want to be able to bring in the camera position data from our current scenes, and especially the B group scene where we have all of our distribution layers rendered out. And that way we can go back to the camera position and settings within our new scene. So what I want to create is a couple of meta nodes we can load in to our new scene with the position we have for the camera, where it's at right now, and then going back to the A group scene and taking the camera position and saving that as well. And we want to create new copies of the camera and apply these meta nodes to them. So I'm going to select our main camera, and we can take a look at its current position, also its rotation, and our focal. So I'm first going to select our little save icon, which is going to duplicate the camera, save it, and we're going to move to camera 2. We also have camera 1, which is basically in the same position. But since I already had camera 1 in there, I'm going to create a new duplicate. We have camera 2, and I'm going to edit the object's graph. We're going to start out with the position and orientation. First, I'm going to select position from the numeric tab, and we can see our current values for X, Y, and Z. I'm going to right mouse click to add in a constant node, constant vector. So now we need to type in our vector information to match what we currently have as the position. Keeping in mind we are using an internal unit of 0.1, which means we need to add some extra values in order to get that to work out right. So let's start with Z. We're going to type in 611 because we have 611 meters and it's 611.2. So what I'm going to do is add in our 2 and leave out the decimal point. And now we have 6,112, which is going to translate into 611.2 meters because our internal unit is 0.1. If our internal unit was set to 1, then we would type in 611.2 to get the meter value. But since we're using 0.1, we need to add that extra decimal place. So for our Y, we have 2.11 kilometers. So type in 211, and now we don't have the rest of that information. As we can see, it is showing up as kilometer. For this scene, that slight amount of movement from the data we don't have isn't going to make that big of a deal and not going to change things very much, but if you do want to see the rest of those values, we can go to File and Options and get rid of the metric automatic mode and just set it to meters. And now we can see the rest of those values showing up, and it will be a little bit easier to figure out exactly which settings we need to use. So now we can see, instead of it being rounded, we have 2107, and I'm just going to add a 0 after that because now we're working with the kilometers. And for our X, 15 and then 200. So 1520, and we're going to add a 0 on the end. And now this is our vector information for the position of this camera. So we're going to type in position, and I'm also going to, under description, just put in B group, because it is the B group scene where we set this position. So now we need to set up orientation. So I can select our position, click to get our red highlighted area, and add in another constant from the left, which will create a duplicate. I'm just going to clear all these values. And we're going to rename it orientation. Still sticking with our B group. And it doesn't look like those vector values set, so I'm just going to hit 0 and enter for X, Y, and Z. So let's move to our orientation. And I'm just going to go ahead and zoom in with our magnifiers. And one thing I did forget to do is on the position, make sure that the Y is negative. So just type in front of your 21070, add a negative, hit enter, and then the position will be corrected. Orientation is going to be exactly the same. There's no vector changes we need to make. The internal unit does not affect orientation. So we can type in a value of 110.146, and our roll is set to 0, and Z, which is our yaw, 212.292. So now our orientation is set up correctly. I'm not worried about our focus amount because I never really set it up for any sort of depth of field effect. And for the most part, that 10 meters should be the same throughout all the cameras. Now, one thing I want to note about the focal, it is right now it's at 249 millimeters. And what we need to do is make a connection to the focal with a number. What I'm going to do is add in a constant and a constant number. And what we need to do is use half of that millimeter amount to equal our number amount. So we can type in 24.5, and that is going to equal 49 millimeters. If you want to keep this number the exact same as the focal, what you can do is add in a combiner node, set it to divide, add in another constant, and set the value to 2. And now we can type in 49, select our combiner. The first connection, input 0, will be connected to the 49, and our second will be the 2. And that way we're dividing the 49 by 2. So now if we want to type in that value of 49 rather than typing in half of it and having to do the math if it gets more complex, although usually dividing something in half is pretty easy, this way you can still just type that in. Now we basically have all of our information ready to go. I am going to rename this divide focal fixer. Or actually we'll just rename it focal because we are going to be connecting to it, and our 2 we're going to set to fixer. And as you can see, our focal got set to 0. So if I connect our focal to this output, we now have a value of 49. Refresh our camera, and that's going to show up correctly. Connect our position to position, orientation to orientation. Click OK, and it's still in the same spot. And that's really just for testing, connecting this camera to those settings, because now we want to use this and create a meta node. So we're going to select all of these nodes we just created, either connected or disconnected to our outputs on the bottom. Up at the top, we have the Create Metanode from Selection button. And we can call this camera B group. If you go to Edit, you can see we have our Vector3 outputs created, and they're named for the outputs we already have them connected to. If it was not connected to any outputs when you created this, there may not be these output nodes, and they won't be named. So what you might have to do is add in an output node. Vector3 output would be our red vector, and a double output is the number or the blue link that we see. So you could set those up, basically adding the output, renaming it, and then connecting it to our constant nodes. So now that we have this set up, I'm just going to go ahead and disconnect these links. We click Edit, we'll still see that those are there. When you go to connect this, you can see the options available. And now we're going to go ahead and save this out. And in our project content, we have a metanode folder. So we're saving out the metanode. And we have our title showing up. And what we could do is just copy our title and paste it for the file name. If you want to add a description, you could put that in, and that will show up in the description line. But we have the camera B group. I'm going to save it, and now we need to go back to our other scene and save out that initial setup. So we can just exit out of this and open up our landscape A scene. And now I'm just going to do exactly the same thing for our current camera position. Select our main camera, save it, go to camera 1, edit the graph, and just create another metanode for this one. So since I just showed you how to do that, I'm going to go ahead and just go forward and make it on my own. So if you need to see the process again, you can just rewind the training a little bit. Although I am going to note that a quick way to speed this up is to load in that metanode. You can right mouse click, load metanode, and then just modify this metanode and save it out with a different name rather than having to recreate the node. And I also want to note that doing so has removed the focal information from this camera, which is another reason why we made a copy right away, and we're working with that. So now I've loaded in landscape A001, and I'm going to save this as, and go up to our scenes folder, and we're going to create a new group, group C. And I'm going to call this Ecosystem Zones. And we'll go ahead and rename this C001, delete our current description, and save this out. So now what we want to do is make a couple copies of the main camera. So now we have camera 1 and camera 2 along with the main camera. Camera 1 I will be renaming Group A, camera 2, Group B. And now we can open up the graph for our Group A camera. We're going to load in the Group A meta node we had created, connect position to position, orientation to orientation, and the focal, which is the only number output, and it will not give us a choice, so it'll automatically connect. Select our Group B camera, load in the meta node, and position, once again, to position, orientation, orientation, and our focal. So now we can switch to these cameras, Group A and the Group B camera. And it looks like there's a small problem with the Group B camera. And actually what I think it is that our terrain was larger once we started working with the other scenes. So what we can do is just select our landscape, increase its size, and this should be the exact position that we had before. It looks like it is matching up correctly now. So it was just that we didn't have enough scale overall, because I did increase the scale and I don't think I saved it as part of landscape Group A. So now we're going to go back to our main camera, since we have Group A and B saved out, and the position we have from the main camera is the Group A position, but now we're going to be modifying and moving it a little bit closer to this area of the scene. This is one part of the scene I do like and would like to have a close-up of. And there was one thing I noticed before, and that was we had foam showing up around the coastline, or basically around this pond or lake, really depending on the scale we end up with. So I'm going to select our water, edit the object, and what we have right now is the global wave control. I'm going to turn it off, and for the foam over waves amount, turn that off. Foam along coasts, set those values to 0. And now we won't have any more foam showing up along the coastline or where the water is intersecting with the terrain.